By the time the Australian Federal Police quietly logged the case as potential domestic homicide, the neighbors had already convinced themselves that nothing truly bad could have happened inside number 17, Wattle Street. And before the story goes any further, take a moment to comment where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel, because this case will test every assumption you have about marriage, trust, and how violence can hide in plain sight. The house belonged to Daniel Mercer and his wife, Claire Mercer, a couple that looked painfully ordinary from the outside, married 12 years, no children, steady jobs, polite waves across the fence, and not a single recorded domestic disturbance. Yet on a rainy Tuesday morning in Melbourne's eastern suburbs, Daniel called emergency services and calmly reported that his wife had gone missing overnight. He said the words without urgency, without panic, and without the kind of fear most people would show when the person they share a bed with disappears. Daniel explained that Claire had been restless lately, talking about space, about starting over, about maybe leaving Australia altogether. He suggested she had finally acted on those thoughts. But what unsettled the first responding officers was not what Daniel said. It was what he did not say. He never asked for help finding her. He never asked how long searches usually take. He never once used the word worried. Inside the house, everything appeared untouched, almost curated in its neatness, like a staged version of domestic peace. Claire's handbag sat on the kitchen counter, her phone charging beside it. Her passport was still in the hallway drawer. Her car remained parked in the driveway, keys hanging exactly where they always were. Friends later told investigators Claire never went anywhere without her phone, and she certainly never traveled without planning it obsessively. When AFP investigators were briefed, one line from the local police summary caught their attention immediately. No confirmed sighting of missing spouse leaving the residence. It was a small detail, but it carried enormous weight. No neighbor saw her leave. No security camera captured her on the street. No transaction placed her anywhere else. It was as if Claire Mercer had vanished without crossing the front door. And when people disappear without leaving a house, investigators do not start by asking where they went. They start by asking what happened inside. AFP investigators approached the case slowly, not because it lacked urgency, but because cases like this collapse when rushed, and the first thing they focused on was the marriage itself, which Daniel Mercer described as strained but respectful, a phrase that sounded rehearsed the moment it left his mouth. Claire's friends told a different story, one filled with quiet tension, long silences, and arguments that never became loud enough to attract attention but lingered for days afterward. Claire had confided to her sister that Daniel hated unpredictability, hated losing control, and hated the idea that Claire was becoming someone he could not manage. Financial records showed the couple had recently argued over money, not because they were struggling, but because Claire had opened a private savings account Daniel did not know about. When investigators asked Daniel about it, he claimed ignorance and laughed it off as something women do when they're planning a surprise. That answer did not land well with the AFP, because it avoided the obvious implication that Claire was preparing for independence. The house itself became the next focus, examined not for dramatic signs of violence, but for subtle inconsistencies. Floors were clean, too clean, as though scrubbed with purpose. A section of carpet in the master bedroom had been recently replaced, Daniel claiming a wine spill from weeks earlier, though no one else remembered any such incident. Forensic testing revealed trace amounts of blood beneath the new carpet fibers, not enough to confirm a crime on its own, but enough to confirm something had been concealed. Meanwhile, Daniel continued living in the house, attending work, answering questions politely, and maintaining a performance of cooperative grief that never quite crossed into genuine distress. He agreed to media appeals but insisted on controlling the wording, repeatedly emphasizing that Claire was free-spirited and capable of leaving on her own. AFP analysts flagged that phrasing immediately because it subtly redirected suspicion away from the house and toward Claire herself. As days passed with no sightings, no financial activity, and no communication from Claire, the investigation shifted from missing person to suspected homicide. Still, the problem remained the same. There was no body, no obvious crime scene, and no single moment anyone could point to and say, "This is when it happened." What the AFP did have was a growing psychological profile of a marriage built on control, and a husband whose story relied entirely on the idea that his wife had walked away from her entire life without leaving a trace. And in cases like this, investigators know one truth better than any other. People can disappear, but lies almost never do. As the AFP dug deeper, the timeline Daniel Mercer provided began to fracture under scrutiny, not dramatically, but in the quiet, dangerous way that makes investigators lean forward instead of pulling back. Daniel claimed he last saw Claire alive around 10:30 p.m. on Monday night, saying she went to bed early after what he described as another long, pointless argument. Phone records showed Claire sent a message to her sister at 11:47 p.m., nearly an hour after Daniel said she was asleep, and the message was short, oddly phrased, and uncharacteristic. "I'm tired. Talk tomorrow." Her sister told investigators Claire never signed off conversations like that, especially not during emotional periods. Even more concerning, the phone never moved after that message was sent. Location data placed it in the house until it was powered off at 12:03 a.m. Daniel said he had gone to sleep around 11 p.m. and did not wake until morning. That left a narrow but critical window where Claire was active, communicating, and then abruptly silent. When confronted, Daniel adjusted his story slightly, suggesting maybe Claire had stayed up reading and he had lost track of time. AFP behavioral analysts noted this was the first time his account shifted, and small shifts are often where the truth starts to leak out. They expanded their inquiry beyond the house, mapping Daniel's movements through digital footprints, workplace access logs, and traffic camera data. Nothing placed him outside the home that night. There was no midnight errand, no drive to clear his head, no movement that could explain Claire leaving without being seen. Inside the marriage, control patterns became clearer. Emails recovered from Claire's private account showed she had contacted a legal service 2 weeks earlier, asking general questions about separation and asset division. She had not yet committed to leaving, but she was planning for it. In one unsent draft, she wrote, "I don't think he will let me go easily." That sentence shifted the entire investigation. It reframed Claire not as a woman who disappeared impulsively, but as someone who feared resistance. The AFP began treating Daniel not as a grieving spouse, but as a man whose world was quietly collapsing. The pressure increased. Interviews became longer, more repetitive, designed to fatigue him into inconsistency. Daniel remained polite, controlled, and eerily calm, but his patience thinned when questions circled back to the bedroom, the carpet, and the hours after midnight. He accused investigators of bias, of turning grief into suspicion. The accusation itself was revealing. Innocent people want clarity. Guilty people want the questions to stop. With no body and no confession, the AFP understood the case would be won not through spectacle, but through accumulation, the slow stacking of facts until denial became impossible. They brought in forensic accountants, not because money proves murder, but because money exposes motive. Claire's private savings account contained modest funds, but it represented something far more dangerous to Daniel than the amount itself: proof of intent. Further analysis showed Claire had changed the beneficiary of her life insurance policy 3 months earlier, removing Daniel and naming her sister instead. Daniel claimed ignorance, but records showed he had accessed the household mail the week the policy confirmation arrived. Investigators also uncovered a series of deleted search queries from Daniel's computer, recovered through forensic imaging. They were not dramatic, not overtly violent, but chilling in their mundanity. How long does bleach smell last? Can blood soak through carpet padding? Missing person timeline Australia. Each search on its own meant nothing. Together, they formed a narrative of preparation. Still, preparation is not a crime. The AFP needed to prove outcome. Attention returned to the house, particularly the backyard, an area Daniel insisted had never been altered. Ground-penetrating radar revealed soil disruption near an old lemon tree, recent enough to be suspicious but not definitive. A warrant allowed investigators to excavate. They found no remains, but they did find personal items. A broken watch Claire wore daily, fragments of fabric consistent with clothing she owned, and traces of lime, commonly used to accelerate decomposition or suppress odor. Daniel's explanation collapsed into silence when confronted with the findings. For the first time, he asked for a lawyer. That moment did not end the investigation, it accelerated it. AFP prosecutors began building a circumstantial case, knowing Australian courts allow murder convictions without a body if the evidence is overwhelming. Witnesses came forward once the case became public. A neighbor recalled hearing a sharp argument late that Monday night, followed by a loud bang, then nothing. Another remembered Daniel Power washing the side of the house the following morning, something he had never done before. Claire's co-workers described her as hopeful but cautious in her final weeks, excited about the idea of freedom but afraid of Daniel's reaction. Each statement added weight. The defense would argue coincidence, misinterpretation, and absence of proof. The AFP argued pattern, motive, and impossibility. People do not vanish midlife without money, documents, or contact. They do not erase themselves while leaving everything behind. As the case moved toward arrest, the central truth became unavoidable. Claire Mercer did not leave that house alive. And the man who benefited most from that fact had been standing in plain sight from the very beginning. The arrest of Daniel Mercer did not come with drama or spectacle, because the AFP understood that control was his oxygen, and denying him an audience was part of dismantling his power. He was taken in early on a Thursday morning, cooperative, composed, and still clinging to the belief that without a body, the case would fracture under its own weight. During the initial post-arrest interview, Daniel returned to the same central claim he had rehearsed for weeks. Claire chose to leave, and everything else was coincidence amplified by suspicion. But this time, investigators no longer asked him open questions. They presented sequences. They showed him the searches. They showed him the insurance change. They showed him the phone message sent at 11:47 p.m. and the power off at 12:03 a.m. They showed him the soil disturbance, the lime residue, the watch fragments. Each piece was placed deliberately, not to provoke confession, but to demonstrate inevitability. Daniel listened, corrected minor details, argued semantics, but never denied the core implication outright. That reluctance became its own evidence. The AFP had learned that Daniel did not lie impulsively. He edited reality carefully, trimming only what threatened him. When confronted with the question of why Claire's phone stopped transmitting while still inside the house, Daniel offered his first truly emotional response, accusing investigators of constructing a narrative because they needed closure. That word mattered. Closure is what the guilty fear, because closure means the story no longer belongs to them. Prosecutors began shaping the case around the idea of coercive control escalating into lethal certainty. Claire had been preparing to leave. Daniel had been preparing to prevent it. The absence of a body was reframed not as a weakness, but as the final act of control. The erasure of proof meant to protect him forever. During committal hearings, the defense attempted to fracture the timeline, suggesting the phone message could have been sent by anyone. The searches could have been curiosity. The backyard items could have been planted. But juries are not built to believe in endless coincidence. They are built to recognize pattern. The AFP leaned into that truth, showing how every alternative explanation required more assumptions than the prosecution's theory. Meanwhile, Claire's family sat through every proceeding, listening to their loved one described in the past tense without ever being allowed the certainty of burial. That absence became part of the case itself. Prosecutors argued that Daniel did not just take Claire's life. He took the family's ability to grieve honestly. The trial date was set, and with it came a quiet shift in Daniel's posture. He stopped smiling. He stopped correcting details. He began listening, calculating, understanding that the house he believed protected him had become the cage closing around him. As the trial unfolded, The AFP presented the story not as a single night of violence, but as the logical end of a long, narrowing corridor. Witnesses testified to Daniel's need for order, his intolerance for unpredictability, his fixation on being seen as the wronged party. Experts explained how coercive control does not always leave bruises, but it leaves fewer and fewer exits. Claire's emails, messages, and private notes were introduced not to portray her as fearful, but as strategic, a woman trying to leave without triggering retaliation. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing speculation, arguing inference, arguing emotion. The judge allowed the evidence to stand. The jury heard about the carpet replacement and the blood traces beneath it. They heard about the searches and the lime. They heard about the phone that never crossed the threshold of the house. The AFP avoided dramatics. They did not accuse Daniel of rage or loss of control. They accused him of calculation. In their version, Claire did not die in chaos. She died because Daniel decided she would not leave him alive. When Daniel took the stand, his testimony was precise and cold. He spoke of love, of misunderstanding, of a system eager to villainize men in domestic disputes. But under cross-examination, the precision collapsed. He could not explain why Claire's belongings remained untouched. He could not explain why no one ever saw her again. He could not explain why his searches aligned so perfectly with the evidence the AFP uncovered. The jury watched a man who wanted to be believed without offering belief-worthy answers. Closing arguments focused on one unavoidable reality. For Claire's version of events to be true, she would have had to erase herself completely, abandon everyone she loved, and disappear without a single confirmed sighting in a country where she had no support network. For the prosecution's version to be true, only one thing had to be accepted: that the last person with her was responsible for her disappearance. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. When they returned, the verdict was delivered without hesitation. Guilty. Daniel Mercer was convicted of murder without a body, sentenced to life imprisonment with no fixed parole period. The judgment acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the case and the extraordinary cruelty of denying a family the truth of remains. The house at number 17, Wattle Street, was eventually sold, renovated, and occupied by new owners who knew nothing of what had happened there. But the case remained within the AFP as a reference point, a reminder that disappearance does not equal escape, and silence does not equal innocence. Claire Mercer never left the house alive, but the truth did, carried slowly, relentlessly, until it could no longer be ignored. Even after the conviction, the case refused to settle into the neat finality people expect from a guilty verdict, because murder without a body leaves behind questions that no sentence can fully answer. Within the AFP, the Mercer case became a subject of internal review, not because of doubt, but because of its precision. Investigators revisited every step, every decision, every moment where the absence of physical remains could have derailed the process. They studied how Daniel Mercer's behavior fit a broader pattern seen in intimate partner homicides where control is the primary driver, not rage. Analysts noted how Daniel never panicked, never begged, never truly searched, because searching would have implied uncertainty. He knew exactly where Claire was, even if no one else did. What troubled many investigators was how easily the case could have slipped away. If Claire had not sent that final message, if the carpet had not been replaced, if Daniel had not searched the wrong phrases at the wrong time, the narrative of voluntary disappearance might have survived. That realization reframed the story from one about a single crime to one about systemic risk. Claire was not invisible. She had friends, family, work, plans. Yet even so, it took weeks before suspicion hardened into certainty. The AFP began using the case to emphasize a critical lesson. Disappearance inside a domestic space must always be treated as a potential crime scene, even when everything appears calm. Meanwhile, Daniel maintained his innocence publicly, filing appeals that focused narrowly on the absence of remains. Each appeal was rejected. The courts ruled consistently that evidence does not require a body when the totality of facts leads to only one reasonable conclusion. Claire's sister spoke once, briefly, after sentencing, saying the family no longer waited for answers, only for time to dull the edges of loss. She described grief not as an explosion, but as erosion, a daily wearing away made worse by not having a place to stand and remember. The house itself became a symbol, not because of anything visibly sinister, but because it looked so ordinary. That ordinariness haunted people. The idea that a life could end so completely, so quietly, in a place meant for safety unsettled even seasoned investigators. Within training sessions, AFP officers began referring to the Mercer indicators, shorthand for subtle warning signs that do not announce themselves loudly but accumulate patiently. Control disguised as care. Calm disguised as cooperation. Absence disguised as choice. The case did not change the law, but it changed how silence was heard. Years later, when documentaries and podcasts revisited the case, public fascination often fixated on the missing body, as if its absence were the most shocking element. But for those who worked it, the most disturbing truth lay elsewhere. Claire Mercer did everything society tells people to do when a relationship becomes unsafe. She confided selectively. She planned quietly. She prepared financially. She avoided confrontation. And still, she never made it out. The AFP understood that reality made the case uncomfortable because it challenged the comforting belief that caution guarantees survival. In reality, caution sometimes only delays the inevitable when control is absolute. Investigators continued to search discreetly for Claire's remains long after the trial, not because they needed proof, but because her family deserved the dignity of recovery. Bushland tips were followed. Old construction sites were examined. None yielded results. Over time, the searches slowed, then stopped, absorbed into the long list of cases where truth exists without physical confirmation. Daniel Mercer aged in prison, his appeals exhausted, his narrative reduced to letters no one outside his legal team read. He never disclosed where Claire was, perhaps because control did not end with conviction. Silence remained his final assertion of power. The AFP noted this pattern too. In cases of coercive control, withholding information becomes the last weapon. The absence of a body was not an oversight. It was intentional. The public eventually moved on, as it always does, but among investigators, the case lingered. It was cited when new missing person reports crossed desks, when partners spoke too calmly, when explanations sounded too tidy. Claire Mercer became a name used not for notoriety, but for vigilance. A reminder that disappearance is not neutral. It is often engineered. And when someone vanishes without stepping outside, the most dangerous place is not the unknown world beyond the door, but the familiar space left behind. As the years passed, the Mercer case stopped being referenced as an anomaly and began to function as a warning, one that quietly reshaped how both the public and investigators understood danger inside intimate relationships. What unsettled people most was not the brutality of the crime, but its restraint. Claire Mercer had not vanished in a dramatic explosion of violence. She disappeared through a process that felt administrative, almost procedural, carried out by someone who understood systems, expectations, and how much uncertainty society is willing to tolerate before it demands answers. Advocacy groups began pointing to the case when explaining why many victims do not simply leave when they sense danger. Claire had tried to leave correctly. She planned carefully, avoided confrontation, secured money, and sought information rather than help, believing that quiet preparation would keep her safe. Instead, that preparation became the trigger. Within AFP briefings, this insight was repeated often. The moment a controlling partner realizes they are losing control is statistically the most lethal phase of a relationship. Daniel Mercer did not act because he was provoked into rage. He acted because he was confronted with the possibility of irrelevance. That distinction mattered. It reframed the crime from an emotional eruption to a calculated decision. The public struggled with that idea, because calculation implies predictability, and predictability implies prevention. People wanted to believe there had been a moment Claire could have chosen differently. The evidence suggested otherwise. Daniel's control did not rely on overt threats. It relied on gradual narrowing, on shaping a reality where Claire believed she could exit safely if she was careful enough. That belief cost her life. Within the AFP, the case influenced how missing spouse reports were triaged, particularly when one partner appeared conspicuously calm. Calm was no longer neutral. It became contextual. Investigators learned to treat absence itself as evidence, not of disappearance, but of erasure. Daniel Mercer remained silent in prison, declining interviews, declining restorative processes, declining every opportunity to provide information that might lead to recovery. That silence was interpreted not as denial, but as consistency. Control did not end with conviction. It adapted. Claire's family eventually stopped speaking publicly, not because they forgave, but because repeating her story felt like reopening a wound that never closed. Yet the story continued without them, passed along in training rooms, courtrooms, and quiet conversations between officers reviewing new cases that felt disturbingly familiar. Claire Mercer became less a person in the public imagination and more a pattern, a set of warning signs that refused to be ignored. Her disappearance stopped being framed as a mystery and began being understood as an outcome, the final step in a process that had been unfolding long before anyone noticed. And in that shift, the case found its true meaning, not as an isolated tragedy, but as a mirror held up to countless homes that look safe until they are not. What ultimately endured from the Mercer case was not the verdict or the sentence, but the uncomfortable clarity it forced upon anyone willing to look closely. Claire Mercer never left the house alive, not because she failed to escape, but because escape was never truly available to her once control hardened into certainty. The house was not merely a location. It was the final boundary of Daniel Mercer's authority, the one line he would not allow her to cross. That understanding reframed everything that came before it, from the calm emergency call to the spotless floors to the carefully managed narrative of voluntary disappearance. None of it was accidental. It was architecture. The AFP closed the case knowing justice had been served in the legal sense, but also knowing justice remained incomplete in every other way that matters to the living. There was no grave to visit, no remains to return, no physical confirmation that might quiet the mind in moments of doubt. Instead, there was only truth established through accumulation, through patience, through refusal to accept the convenient story. That truth carried forward, influencing how future cases were approached and how silence was interpreted. The absence of Claire's body did not weaken her story. It strengthened it because it forced attention onto what could be proven without spectacle. Daniel Mercer faded into institutional obscurity, another inmate insisting history would vindicate him, while history did the opposite. It clarified. Each retelling sharpened the narrative until ambiguity had nowhere left to hide. The Mercer case became a reminder that violence does not always look violent, and that danger can exist behind routines so ordinary they seem protective. It challenged the idea that safety is visible, that harm announces itself, that love and control cannot occupy the same space. Claire Mercer's life ended quietly, but her absence refused to remain quiet. It demanded interpretation, responsibility, and change. And for those who heard the story from beginning to end, it left behind a single unsettling truth. When someone disappears without ever leaving, the question is not where they went, but why the world took so long to realize they were never allowed to go at all.